RIA is really pleased today to have as a featured guest on a very timely topic one of the nation's leading aviation attorneys from the firm of Dombroff, Gilmore, Jacques and French, Mark Dombroff, who has been practicing aviation law for how many years, Mark? 40 years of practicing aviation law. Both from every aspect at the FAA, representing airlines, aviation manufacturers, insurance companies. And we're really pleased to have Mark here share his thoughts and perspectives with you, give you a little bit of a how-to primer on something that we hope you never have to how to do. So with that, I want to turn it over to Mark. Thank you. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Roger. If everyone will bear with me, I'm not going to use the podium and I'm not even going to use the stage. I'd rather talk from down here. That introduction is what I would consider to be classically lawyer-like on the part of Roger, who is a good friend, and I thank very much for inviting me. It was short, it was pithy, and it was grossly understated. I think that as a lawyer, we've come to learn, and I'm sure a number of you have heard this, that there are three great lies in this country. The first is the check is in the mail. The second is, of course, I'll love you in the morning. And the third is, I'm a lawyer and I'm here to help you. I don't know about the first two. I hope I can show you that the third is not a lie. I arrived here this morning in time to hear Chairman Hersman speak. And she talked about at least two of our clients. And in effect, those two clients, one of whom is U.S. Airways, in the context that she talked about it, was the Miracle on the Hudson, and the other was Continental Connection 3407 Colgan Air in Buffalo. And those two clients and the events surrounding those two events have provided effectively the agenda for the National Transportation Safety Board and the subject of speeches for Chairman Hersman for the balance of her career, whether it's at the NTSB or otherwise. And as a footnote, I would point out, at the risk of being politically incorrect, being a member of the NTSB is the greatest job in the world. You have no power of enforcement. You have no power of regulation. You have the ability to make recommendations and then criticize people when they do not follow those recommendations. It is the best job in the government. It is without any real accountability, except to the extent they view themselves as being accountable to the Congress, to the media, and to the public, and you can sum all of that up in accountable to the media. Now, having said that, it's a fact of life, and what happens after an accident is a fact of life. And what I'd like to talk about is something that this industry, particularly the regional segment of the airline industry, you are going to have to live with for the next several years. And it is the spectrum that is created by the Miracle on the Hudson at the one end and Continental Connection 3407 at the other end. And that is the agenda, whether it is for the FAA or it is for the NTSB or the media or the public, that you are going to have to deal with. The question is, how do you deal with it, and what really does happen after an accident? The first thing I will tell you, folks, after an accident is not the time that you first want to have to meet me or somebody like me. The reason is, after an accident, everything that is coming down on an airline is so demanding, is so pressure-filled, is so consuming, that it is not the time to build relationships. It is not the time to build new relationships of trust and confidence in a situation where the airline is the least prepared to deal with what happens following the accident. And the reason the airline is the least prepared to deal with what happens following an accident is presumably the airline is a safe operation. And presumably you've not gone through an accident before, and the likelihood is if you have gone through an accident before, there's probably very little, if any, corporate memory or history or experience still resident within the company. Think of it this way. When an accident occurs, what really happens is that a whole lot of trains leave the station all at the same time. And the only passenger that has to be on every one of those trains, every single one of those trains, is the airline. We'll come back to what those trains are in a second, but I will tell you right now, the airline is the least equipped of everybody involved in a post-accident scenario to deal with what happens post-accident. The reason the airline is least equipped is that, for the very reasons I've given you, you either don't have the experience by virtue of having run a safe operation, or you don't have the corporate memory and history by virtue of the last time it occurred. Compare that to the airframe manufacturer who's operating their aircraft or having their aircraft operated throughout the world, has a large accident investigation department that does nothing but investigate accidents and maintain liaison with the NTSB and other accident investigation authorities throughout the world. Compare that to the engine manufacturer who's in the same position. They have dedicated accident investigators who do nothing but investigate accidents and incidents and maintain liaison with accident investigation authorities throughout the world. Compare that to the FAA, the only party to an accident investigation that is statutorily authorized to be part of the investigation. The NTSB has no say about them participating. I don't know how many of you, if any of you, have come to our symposium. We put on a day-and-a-half symposium for the airline industry once a year in January in Washington, in Virginia. No charge. You're all welcome as members of the airline industry. At the last symposium in January of this year, Peggy Gilligan, who all of you know is the Associate Administrator for Aviation Safety, was on an FAA panel, and I asked Peggy in front of about 250 airline people, why is it that the FAA and the NTSB hate one another? And before Peggy could answer, the entire room burst into applause because it was the question everybody in the airline industry wanted to ask, but nobody wanted to be identified as having asked it, of effectively the top safety regulator at the FAA. The FAA is statutorily mandated and permitted to be a party to the investigation. No one else is. Everyone else is there because they can make a technical contribution, whether it's the airframe manufacturer, the engine manufacturer, the airline. At that point also, the unions become involved as a separate entity. We'll come back to that in a second. The passengers have no right to be involved. The families have no rights to be involved because the standard is, in terms of being a party, the standard is whether or not they can make a technical contribution to the accident. The unions have a right, and it might be more than one union. It might be the pilots union, the flight attendants union, the mechanics union, and they all would have a separate identity. Now, all this leads to a conclusion in terms of relationships. Once an accident occurs, the relationship between the airline and all of these various parties changes from the relationship it was on a day-to-day basis. On a day-to-day basis, these are your employees. After an accident, they are parties to an investigation, and they want to protect their constituencies. Before the accident, the airframe manufacturer is there to support the airframe you are operating. Following the accident, they are there as a party to the investigation, and they want to protect the fleet and not necessarily the airline as the operator. And the same thing is true of the engine manufacturer. The same thing is true of the FAA. Prior to the accident, they held your certificate. After the accident, they are there to protect the controllers and not necessarily to look after your interests. So one of the trains that leaves the station following the accident is the accident investigation itself. And you are obviously, as an airline, an integral part of that whole process.